Well, we can cross now to our EU, our Brussels correspondent, who is currently in Barcelona and who has penned a book about the US relationship with the European Union, The Owned Continent, it is called, and it gives an assessment of Europe's dependence on the United States and describes how Donald Trump has exploited that. However, it also proposes a way out. Dave Keating, lovely to see you. Dave, before we get to your book, I have to start by asking, the EU reacts to the US move in Venezuela. Overall, it seemed somewhat muted.
Yeah, muted and even really giving a stamp of approval to the U.S. operation. No European leader has been willing to criticize the U.S. operation except Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain. He's actually joined in on a separate joint communication from several Latin American countries, including Mexico and Brazil, condemning the operation. But meanwhile, the EU, both EU leaders and national leaders in the EU, have not been willing to criticize it. Some have openly endorsed it. Giorgia Meloni saying of Italy that she thinks it's legitimate. We had President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer of France and the UK seeming to give their stamp of approval by focusing on the positives of the removal of the regime, talking about upholding international law, but not acknowledging that international law was most likely violated already through the US operation. Then we had Germany's Friedrich Merz, who said that the legality of the US operation is complex and he needs time to look into it. That was kind of backed up by Greece's prime minister, also from the center right, who said that now is not the time to be talking about whether or not the US operation was legal. So that has really angered a lot of people across the continent who were looking for a more robust response. And critically, it has angered leaders in South America, notably Brazil's President Lula. And that's bad news for the Mercosur deal, which is still up in the air. That's the free trade agreement between Europe and these South American countries. This now is likely to cause a rift between Brazil and European countries that could affect that deal. It could also impact support for Ukraine. It's thought that the reason that European leaders are being so coy here, that are not coming out to speak up for international law in regards to what the US just did, is because they're worried about Trump completely pulling support for Ukraine more than the US has already pulled already. And that will probably overshadow a meeting tomorrow of the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Paris. That is the countries that are supporting Ukraine. This issue is likely to be hanging over it.
Well, Dave, your book really is being published in a month when once again we're seeing Europe's position in the face of the United States, and really it does look like it is being dominated by that. When you say when it comes to the Ukraine, Europe is constantly looking to try and have a seat even at the table of the negotiations. We've seen with the war on Gaza as well, a very quiet European Union, in particular Europe, no real voice. Tell us a bit more why you think that is.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the number one questions I've been asked by people over the past year. As a journalist, people across Europe have been asking me, why are our leaders continually surrendering to Donald Trump? The book is trying to explore some of the psychological reasons for that, actually, that America dominates Europeans' daily lives, not just militarily. Europe isn't just militarily dependent on the United States, a subject that is widely being explored now, but it's also economically dependent and culturally dependent. If you turn on a TV or radio in Europe, you are most likely going to encounter an American TV show or an American song. Every day you use an American phone to access American social media. You pay with American credit cards. You watch movies with American streaming services. You are inundated with American culture as a European from the time you're born, and that impacts Europeans psychologically. Notably, it starts to make Europeans almost feel like they live in the United States, and that can make it difficult to try to change the thinking about the United States as perhaps an adversary. So now, even as Donald Trump is coming out again with these threats to invade and annex a territory of an EU member state, Greenland, part of Denmark, we're still seeing European leaders just not register, not wanting to acknowledge what their own eyes and ears can see, which is that the United States is threatening Europe. Because of this psychology, this kind of owned psychology in Europe, we see Europeans just really unable to change their thinking about the United States. They're still thinking about the United States as if it was 10 years ago. So the book is trying to look at the psychological reasons for that, how this developed, tracing how the American dominance in Europe developed, but also looking at ways that through the EU, Europeans could actually lessen the effect of that dominance.
It is quite fascinating to look at the extent to which proposed cultural domination impacting the mentality, and Europeans still having this vision of the American dream and that what is over in the United States is necessarily better than what's in Europe. But does it not also date back to, the world wars and the role that the United States played? Is that not what is lingering in European minds?
Yes, certainly this mostly started from World War II, right after, especially after the Cold War, and the Europe was divided into two different halves, and you had American soldiers and American military bases establishing themselves in Western Europe. But actually, my book traces this back to World War I, when the European film industry was decimated and the American movie companies quickly moved into Europe to fill the vacuum and had established a major dominance in European movie theaters already by the mid-1920s. So really, the cultural dominance, I think, starts a lot earlier than most Europeans realize. I think Europeans are kind of aware that their social media, for instance, now is completely American dominated, but actually this is a phenomenon that goes back decades. And myself, as an American who grew up in the United States and moved to Europe in my 20s, it was quite jarring, actually. And I've had this conversation with a lot of other American expats who have lived in Europe a long time, that it's almost like you didn't leave the United States by moving to Europe because you're so surrounded by American culture at all times.
Now, one thing, and even with that cultural dominance, it's interesting, you note in your book that even when it comes to news, Europeans seem more affected by, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States than when it's local Black Lives Matter movements in Brussels or France or elsewhere. And one thing you also highlight is that you feel that Europeans still have a problem of national mindsets as opposed to the federal mindsets that we should, in your opinion, if I've read your book correctly, have when we're part of the European Union.
Yeah, that's also been something really striking to me, just how much news coverage here in Europe is dominated by news from the United States. If you open up a newspaper, you are certainly going to find articles about the United States, probably on the front page, and also in broadcast news. And this leads to a situation where Europeans know more about politics in the United States, certainly than they know about European politics, but in some cases, even more than they know about their own national politics, because they're seeing this saturation of American news coverage, not only in news, but then they're also now getting that reinforced through social media feeds. They're getting actually very little information about European politics, but they're getting inundated by the culture wars from the United States, by the political battles, the political developments. And again, this can lead to an impression among Europeans that they somehow live in the United States, rather than America being a foreign country, that it's somehow a part of the European fabric, an unavoidable part. And that then hinders people from learning about their own European politics, learning about how a united Europe could stand up to the United States, particularly in cases like we've seen over the past couple days. And it makes this kind of passive mindset that allows the United States to really get away with quite a lot in Europe when you look particularly at recent developments.
Well, indeed, and even there's been ones that hit even directly closer to home with, we've seen how European leaders have reacted to Trump's trade tariffs. We've seen them up their defense spending very rapidly when Trump demands. You feel that they maybe went too far, too fast, and you've been explaining perhaps why that. But how can Europe turn things around? I mean, how are leaders still feeling that they have to play up to Trump and not feeling that they can present what is a very sizable economy and not, feel their own weight, their own power in the world?
Yeah, there is a very defeatist attitude in Europe, and the line I always hear, and I've also been hearing the past couple of days in terms of how Europeans should respond to the US action in Venezuela, there's nothing we can do. I always hear that from Europeans. It's a very defeatist attitude, and it's not true. There's a lot of tools that Europe has in its tool belt. There was this so-called nuclear option being developed, pushed by France ahead of that trade deal surrender by President von der Leyen in July, where the EU could have hit back with tariffs against US services in which the EU, Europe, has a trade deficit with the United States, obviously being inundated with American services imports. Also, they had a mechanism that they could have used to combat trade extortion, but our European leaders chose not to use those tools. I mean, this is a single market that is larger than the United States. By purchasing power parity, it is a roughly equal economy to the United States, and yet Europe often behaves as if it's a very small country that has no choice but to follow the diktats of the United States. And that's just not reflective of Europe's actual power, not just economically, but also potentially militarily, if Europe was able to coordinate its national militaries in a way where Europe could act independently and sovereignly in making military actions. Unfortunately, our European leaders have not really been willing to use those tools, and I think there's also guilt here on the people of Europe, who after all are electing those European leaders, and also aren't really thinking about the ways that Europe can exercise power on the world stage.
Okay, Dave Keating, unfortunately we'll have to leave it there, but thanks very much for your time, Dave Keating. His book, The Owned Continent, is out this month.